Okay. So this class we're just going to be discussing the current stance of fiscal policy. Technically, we're actually kind of done with the syllabus requirements of fiscal policy, because we've already covered the budget outcomes. We've covered the effects of budgetary changes on resource use, income distribution, and economic activity. This was all done on Monday. Then methods of financing a deficit and the uses of a surplus was done yesterday when you guys watched the Ed Roller videos and took notes. But I still want to discuss the current stance of fiscal policy because I feel like we haven't discussed enough the government rules and regulations, or what the government has done in regards to fiscal policy. And the current stance of fiscal policy is just going to give you a very brief timeline of the policies implemented in the past few years. And don't worry about writing it down while I'm teaching. I have a set of questions that you guys need to answer towards the end. So I'm just going to try and make this as short as possible so you don't get more homework, but I'm pretty sure you will. Okay, so the current stance of fiscal policy. Now, generally, before I actually go on, just a very quick revision of fiscal policy. We all know that fiscal policy and monetary policy are both macroeconomic policies and they're demand-side policies. Now, when I say demand-side policies, that basically means that they are there to influence the demand of consumers, right? And one way, the very basic way that we studied was for monetary policies to increase or decrease interest rates, and for fiscal policy, it's in regards to taxation and taxation revenue. But now that we've studied the budget and we've studied the other impacts of fiscal policy, we've also learned that it's to do with really everything that's in the budget. So it's to do with all kinds of government spending for the people, so that people can actually then spend more and consume more. That's going to influence economic growth in the long term, right? And that's what this is. So, but again, just because you guys have to make a timeline towards the end, this timeline is just really going to help you understand. It's really going to help you understand the fiscal policy implementations in the past few years, and then we're going to compare that to 2020 and how the government is, what the government is doing right now compared to the past, because right now we are officially in a recession, right? First time in the past 30 years, so that really is a big deal. Anyway, okay. During the 2010s decade, fiscal policy generally played a neutral or mildly contractionary role. Along with that, another thing to keep in mind is that it's a lot easier for the government to implement monetary policy than fiscal policy, because fiscal policy is mainly added in the budget and it requires a lot of money, a lot of rules and regulations. Monetary policy, you just really need to increase or decrease interest rates. That's just to do with RBA, and the RBA really just manages that very well. And that's what the RBA has been doing, right? Last year in June, they reduced the interest rate to 1%. Then I guess towards September, October, they reduced it to 0.7%. And right now, we all know in March, they reduced it to 0.25% because, again, we are officially in recession. So it's a lot more easier for them to actually implement monetary policy than fiscal policy. And fiscal policy hasn't played a very big role in the past 10 years as compared to monetary policy. Monetary policy has played a very big role, right? So again, in recent decades, fiscal policy has played a minor support role in the policy mix, whilst monetary policy plays a major role in macroeconomic management. Anyway, during the 2010s, fiscal policy generally played a neutral or mildly contractionary role as government sought to reduce the budget deficit following the crisis. So the aim of the government was not to implement fiscal policy for economic growth. It was really just to reduce the budget deficit, and they were going to implement fiscal policy to do that, so to basically achieve that goal, right? Fiscal policy played a limited role between the mid-90s and 2008. During this period, we achieved a lot of budget surpluses, mainly because of the mining boom. I am trying to make this... Right, great. I've just highlighted the important things, okay? Then, the exception to the general... Yep. So the exception to the general rule of fiscal policy, playing a minor role in the policy, as we discussed, mix occurs during the periods of economic downturn. So fiscal policy really comes in the picture or is really implemented massively when there's an economic downturn, exactly what we're going through right now, right? So during a recession, that's when the government comes up and they implement as much fiscal policy as they can. And what is really fiscal policy? You know, we looked at the budget outcome. It's really just all kinds of government policies or the government help that people can get to stimulate economic growth, to stimulate consumer spending. Right, and that's what the government's doing with the JobKeeper payment, with a lot of money given to medium businesses, SMEs. All of that is really the aim of that is just to stimulate economic growth, is to increase consumer spending. Such as the GFC in 2008-2009, that's when the government actually implemented fiscal policy. And after that, massively, the government implemented fiscal policy now. In response to the threat of recession, the Rudd government adopted a very expansionary fiscal policy stance. And again, we all know that expansionary fiscal policy basically just means to expand the economy. So that's when you actually give more benefits to people. Contractionary fiscal policy basically means to contract the economy. So that's when you actually take more benefits from people. So that's when you probably increase tax rates or whatever. The combination of discretionary stimulus spending and a cyclical fall in taxation revenue, so the fiscal balance fall by $75 billion or 6% of the GDP in 2008, 2010, mainly because the government was actually giving a lot of discretionary stimulus spending and cyclical fall in taxation. So they reduced taxation revenue because, again, people were suffering. We almost hit a recession in the GFC. And also to stimulate spending, so to increase spending as well. And that's when we actually saw a fall of $75 billion, or 6% of GDP basically was spent for the people. This was a dramatic reversal for the mildly contractionary or neutral stance that the government has been implementing over the years, because this was expansionary, right? I need you guys to write this down later. Don't write it down yet. Just because, as I said, I'm just going to try and speed up so that I can give you more class time to actually take notes. Now, since 2010-2011, the fiscal policy has been mildly contractionary, as we discussed. The last time fiscal policy was this expansionary as it is in 2020 was probably in the recession, which was in the 1990s. But then again, closest to that was actually during the GFC, because we almost hit a recession and the government did whatever they can to spend on people. So that was 6% of the GDP that they actually spent on people. Now, to the 2019-2020 budget was the 2019 budget, which was brought down a month early because of the May election, forecasted Australia's first big surplus since 2007, amounting to 7.1 billion or 0.4% of GDP. You guys need to write this down as well, that we had a budget surplus, but it was only 0.4% of the GDP. This reflected a mildly contractionary fiscal policy stance in 2019-2020, despite slowing economic growth. Now, if you actually look at the past few years, Australia hasn't been doing bad. We have been performing quite well, but our economic growth could definitely be better, right? So we could have had more economic growth, but we did not. And we've basically had what you call a slow economic growth. We've had economic growth, but we haven't had enough of it. And that's what we've just been facing in the past few years, really just ever since the GFC. We did have like a boost up during when the Australian dollar was higher than the US dollar in 2011, but those were for other financial reasons. But we've just had a slow economic growth, which is why our economy basically massively hit a recession this time, because our economy was growing but wasn't growing enough anyway, right? Apart from that, the 2009-2020 budget identified as its fiscal strategy the goal of returning the budget surplus to 1% of GDP. Obviously, that's not happening now because of the recession, which was very unexpected. The fiscal strategy to achieve this includes a general commitment to restraining growth spending, offsetting increased spending with other spending cuts. So they basically just want people to spend more. That's what we discussed last time as well. People just weren't spending enough, and the government just wanted to spend more. Wanted people to spend more, giving priority to spending that increases productivity and workforce participation rate. saving increased revenue received due to important economic condition, and reducing the net debt. So we know we're already in debt. Our CAD was also in surplus this year, but it wasn't in a lot of surplus, and obviously we all know during the recession we're already in surplus. So since the 2008-2019 budget, the fiscal strategy has included a commitment not to allow tax receipts to rise above 23.9% of GDP. That is actually really interesting, and I would like you guys to write that down as well later on. The governments have often placed a ceiling on a tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, and the most recent ceiling as of last year or the year before is 23.9%, so please do write that down. The cyclical factors influencing the budget reflects developments in the domestic and global economy in the past decade. When I say cyclical factors, those are factors to do with the business cycle. So that's economic boom, a recession, or a downturn, or all of that. Now these are the cyclical factors. Australia has been growing below its medium-run economic growth rate for a number of years, as we discussed in chapter 7 as well. Lower growth rate that's because of a number of things, because we discussed that including the end of the mining boom, weaker growth in household consumption due to lower wages and slow. So ever since the GFC, the wage growth has been there, but just like the economic growth, it hasn't been there enough, right? Or the wages could have been increased so that people could easily spend more, but that just never really happened as such. And because that's basically a major influence in why economic growth hasn't been as big as it was expected to be. So we did recover from the GFC, but we didn't recover well enough. Not just us, it's actually the global economy. The global economy wasn't able to recover well enough. And that's obviously impacted the Australian economy, right? Company tax receipts were slow to recover in the aftermath of the GFC. During the GFC, a number of companies incurred significant losses. When these companies returned to profitability for taxation purposes, they were able to offset their profits from losses in the previous years. So again, by the time that the companies were able to actually recover from the GFC, they were only then just able to recover the profits that they could have gained in the past few years. So they were still not doing well enough as they expected. So they weren't able to pay taxes enough, right? Sadly. The labor market was slow to recover from the GFC, and nominal wage growth was slower, as we just discussed. The global economic recovery was also very, very weak, weaker than expected, and this meant that external conditions were generally favorable for Australia. They were not as favorable as they had been in the 2000s. So in 2000s, it was very favorable. That's why we had the mining boom. But ever since the 2010s, the global economy generally hasn't been performing as well as we expected. We have been stable. Global economy has been stable, but it hasn't been stable enough. And then we have the structural factors, that is discretionary government policy decisions that have played an important role. Since 2009 and 2010, structural factors have helped reduce the deficit, as governments have sought to restrain expenditure in order to accelerate the fiscal balance. 2020, government spending is expected to be around 24.6% of GDP, but it's a lot more than that now because of the recession. However, a number of structural pressures are having a negative effect on fiscal sustainability. Examples of these are structural pressures include Australia's aging population. We've been discussing aging population since quite a while. The main issue is Medicare. The thing is that the government basically just needs to provide Medicare. If we have an aging population, we still have an aging population. The Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that Australia's aging population will result in additional costs. Sorry, I'm just trying to highlight this. Never mind, will result in additional cost of around $36 billion per year by the end of the decade, more than the government's total annual expenditure on Medicare. So that's a lot that the government will be spending on just medical for aging population. That's what they don't want. They basically want the younger population to come up so that we can truly have a boost. That's why, as we discussed earlier as well, the government is also trying to make the retirement age a lot higher than it is now. Now, another structural reason for the slow recovery in tax revenues is the structural reductions in personal income tax that were made during the boom. Again, the exact same thing, reductions in personal income tax in 2019 and 2020 budgets, once the three stages are fully implemented, are expected to reduce, because now we're going to discuss the three stages, which were for the 2019-2020 budget. It was right here. I think it's in the next page, so we'll discuss it then. Once the three stages are fully implemented, are expected to reduce revenue by more than $30 billion per year. And we're going to come to that while we discuss the impacts of recent fiscal policy. Now, ideally, I would actually, in regards to the impacts of recent fiscal policy, I would just discuss this. But this also gives you a very, very good overview of not just the past 10 years, but like a lot more than that. So I'm just very, very briefly going to go through this. We've actually already discussed it quite well when we did the second dot point over here. But I still, the more you know, the better it is, right? And there's certain things that I want you guys to write from this as well. So the first thing we're going to discuss is economic growth. According to the Keynesian model, which was, again, we've discussed it in year 11, it was implemented throughout the 1940s and the 1970s. It argued that an expansionary budget involving increased spending or tax cuts would accelerate growth. We all know that is the case. When there's an expansionary budget, that basically just means that you want to expand the economy. So in that case, you give up more stimulus packages, you reduce taxes, and that's going to make people spend more. The exact same thing for the contractionary budget. That basically means that you want to contract the economy. You don't want people to spend more. That's when you increase taxes and reduce government spending, right? Then, since the 1990s, the role of fiscal policy in influencing economic growth has been reduced to an equational role as counterbalance to the level of economic activity, as monetary policy has acted as the main instrument. As we discussed, monetary policy has mainly been implemented compared to fiscal policy. However, a threat of severe financial crisis during the GFC again played a central role in managing the level of growth. A large fiscal stimulus saw spending increase by almost one quarter of 2008 in the 2008-2009 budget, the largest spending increase since the 1970s. This I would like you guys to write down, because this is a very good comparison that you can make in your essay responses. Perhaps in your essay responses, I would write down about COVID, and then I would compare that to the GFC and the 2019 recession. The large fiscal stimulus of the 2008-2009 budget is generally regarded as one of the most successful examples of fiscal policy. Again, a very, very good example for you to add. The government made an immediate injection in the economy of cash payments to households in December 2008 to help sustain household consumption. Treasury estimated the fiscal stimulus added 2% of economic growth, with the economy growing by 1.4%. Please write that down as well. Although fiscal policy may be effective in stimulating economic growth, which we know it is, in the short to medium run, its effectiveness may diminish in the accumulation of past budget deficits. Now, look, when it comes to monetary policy, another reason why it's so easy to implement is just because you really just have to play around with the cash rate, right? And we've discussed a bit of that in year 11, and we discussed that in the next chapter as well. With the fiscal policy is that you can implement fiscal policy during a recession, as we are right now, but its aftermath is a lot greater, right? Right, for us to implement, for the government to spend so much money on people right now, it's great for us. Now, what's not very great for us is the fact that the government will have to pay all of that back, because currently we're going into a deficit. So we've basically accumulated a lot more debt, right? And that's what this is talking about. Apart from that, influencing economic growth was a major priority of fiscal policy during the 2010s, and that's a major priority right now as well. The main goal of fiscal policy was to return the budget to surplus gradually, and it basically took us 10 years to come to a surplus. So we were kind of recovering from the GFC, and ever since then, up until now, up until 2019, it took us that long to actually recover to a surplus. And again, the 23.9% of GDP of tax revenue is what we just discussed earlier as well. Yep, this is important. Now, this is the three stages that I said I'll discuss in the next page. So the 2019-2020 budget, and again, I'm discussing this mainly because it mentions the 2019-2020 budget, just because the 2020-21 budget is not out yet. Once it does come out, and hopefully inshallah it's before your HSC, I'm happy to give a class and then we'll discuss that as well. The 2019-2020 budget announced three stages of reduction in personal income tax, with the first stage providing a stimulus to economic growth. The first stage delivered a low and middle income tax offset during the 4 years from 2018 to 2022. The LMITO is a tax cut for taxpayers earning up to $126,000 per year. Instead of reducing rates of tax, it provides a dollar reduction on a taxpayer's overall tax bill, which is really, really interesting. Now, all of this was implemented, but then the recession happened. Okay? I'm not too sure if they're still implementing it now, but regardless, this was the plan for them. However, I doubt they're still implementing it now. Okay? Instead of reducing tax rates, yep, the amount varies accordingly, according to the income that they're paid. While the 2019-2020 budget was mildly contractionary overall because it involved a move from a deficit to a surplus, this tax offset increased disposable incomes and made fiscal policy less contractionary than it would otherwise. Fully implemented three stages of tax cuts contained in the 2019-2020 budget are expected to reduce the revenue by $158 billion. Again, all of this was done just because we had a budget surplus. This can't be done now just because we are in a massive deficit. However, I think the government would still consider this purely just because they need to increase spending to increase economic growth, if the government can afford it. However, I doubt that the government can. And always keep in mind, I forgot my point, never mind. Moving on to unemployment and workforce participation rate. Again, we discussed this before as well, but let's cover it again. Many of these policies are aimed at boosting labor supply and reducing the NAIRU, basically, because the NAIRU is at 5%. The lower it is, the better. So the NAIRU goes to 4% or 3%. Good for us. That basically means that the country is at full employment at 3%, which is really, really great. That means that only 3% of the people are unemployed in the country. The 2019-2020 budget included $25 billion skills package to address skills shortages and boost apprenticeships. Please write this down. 2018-2019 budget introduced more choices for a longer life package designed to assist older Australians. The 2017-2018 budget announced that employers who bring overseas workers into Australian temporary work visas were be required to pay a new skilling Australians fund, which is great as well. All of this is great. This was implemented just to basically reduce unemployment in Australia. And I'm pretty sure it was implemented because this is fairly old. This is 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019. This as well, I believe, was implemented up until the recession hit. But I'm not too sure if it's still being implemented right now. But that's the thing, this is not the just because there's a lot of unemployment in Australia, this still can be the focus. But with a lot of other things in regards to economic growth and national savings and all of that, it might not be. Now, in regards to resource use, direct subsidies to industries have declined to less than $4 billion per year. In 2013, and the Abbott government decided not to step in to prevent the closure of Australian automotive manufacturing sector. However, that still happened later on. There has been a decline in government's direct provision of economic services such as road, rail, and aviation transport. And let's just not talk about aviation right now. The aviation industry is massively suffering and the government isn't really helping them as much. Nevertheless, some areas of government expenditure still have a significant effect on resource allocation. For example, the 2016-2017 budget included $30 billion in contained a plan for 100 billion in transport infrastructure. I loved this example. That's why I highlighted this, because it's to do with environmental change, and we've discussed that in class. An example of regulation that influences resource use is the renewable energy target that aims to ensure 23% of energy generation comes from renewable resources. However, I highly doubt it. I think it's a target, but we obviously haven't reached that target. I'm going to try and make this as short as possible. Let me just see what else do I. Okay, I just have one more main dot point after this. National savings and the current account deficit. If you actually, technically we've discussed, okay, so fiscal policy can influence an economy's levels of national savings either by increasing savings or detracting savings through deficits. And we also know for a fact that if the current account deficit is really high, that basically just means that we have to pay more to other countries because we've invested in them or whatever that is, and that in turn basically just puts us in trouble. But the figure, this figure basically tells us that there's no direct link between the current account balance and the savings. So as figure 14.5 shows, there is no obvious linkage between Australia's budget outcome and the current account deficit. In some periods, such as the mid-20s, the current account deficit may increase even when Australia is recording a budget surplus. The reason for this is because of the mining boom. We had a surplus mainly because of the mining boom, because we got a lot of money from that. But the current account deficit was because we invested in a lot of other countries as well. And we had a lot of foreign investments because of the mining boom in the mining companies over here, and we had to pay them back, right? This reflects that although budget surpluses may have been contributing to higher national incomes during this time, increased private investment was having a much larger effect on increasing Australia's saving and investment gap. The saving and investment gap isn't a big deal anymore, okay? So I don't want you guys to focus on this as much. The saving and investment gap was just the fact that people weren't saving enough, or people were saving enough, but that was towards the past few years. Last year, the main issue was that people weren't spending enough. Now the main issue is our recession. And then we have distribution of income. This as well we've discussed in the distribution of income chapter. However, I would like you guys to read through this, okay? Especially the blue writing over here. This is very important for you to write down, because it basically gives us an idea about the government trying to reduce income inequality in Australia. And then now I'm just and please read, okay. Read through this, please. 2019-2020 budgets contain changes in personal income tax, beginning with tax reductions for lower income earners. We've discussed this. We've discussed the low to middle income earners. However, I would like you, and this is basically exactly what we just discussed in the past page, I would like you guys to write down the stats as much as you can, okay? What I want to focus on for the next 5 minutes is this. That's the economic response to the coronavirus. The budget is providing $259 billion in fiscal and balance sheet support, which is equal to around 13.33% of annual GDP. If you remember when we discussed the GFC, in the GFC, the government spent around $75 billion, which was 6% of the GDP. Right now, we're spending 13.3% of the GDP. That's how bad the economy is at the moment. And this is just a summary of economic spending of the government for people. What I would like you guys to do is so it's divided into 3 parts. One is support for individuals and households, then there's support for businesses, and then there is support for supporting the flow of credit within Australia, so the flow of money. I just want you guys to write down any 3 main of these dot points along with the stats. Like crazy important for USAs, or just generally for your HSC, because this just basically gives you an overview of all the fiscal stimulus that the government has given to the people. And I'm pretty sure, I guarantee you, there's going to be a question about this in the HSC. Firstly, there's the job keepers. The government gave a fortnightly payment of $1,500. Then there's income support for individuals. Since April to 27 April, the government has temporarily expanded eligibility to support income payments, and people get $550 per fortnight. Then there's payments for household as well, which is $750, which is great. Then temporary superannuation as well. People could actually take a superannuation, which is actually, I think it was the first time in history in Australia that people were able to take out their superannuation, which is great. That's if they've had the pay cut. If you haven't had a pay cut, you weren't allowed to take it out. And support for businesses, again, we all know that there was the JobKeeper payment, and that's basically around, wait, eligible businesses may include sole traders whose turnover has reduced by 30%. If they have a turnover of less than $1 billion or by 50%, then they have a turnover. So basically the point is that if you had a turnover of 30% to 50%, that basically just means that you were eligible for JobKeeper payments. And that's mainly his hospitality, the aviation industry. A lot of those industries got these. They're boosting the cash flow for employees as well. The government spent a lot on that. Increasing the instant asset write-off, backing business investment. The government basically helped. That's why we spend 13% of our GDP on that. Then there's flow of credit within Australia. SMEs are small, medium enterprises. That's basically small to medium businesses. The government paid them as well. The government will provide a guarantee of 50% to SME lenders to support the short-term unsecured loans as well. Quick and efficient access to credit for small businesses. Reserve Bank of Australia reduced the cash rate. We all know that. Now, if you look at the actual timeline, this is a timeline of implementation. Started on the 25th of March up until, some of them started 25th of March and some of them started from the 21st of July. This actually is a summary of all that's mentioned above. Okay, it tells you from when it started. So if I were you, I would probably just summarize this up and write this down, like make like a separate fact sheet, or really just print this. If you guys want this printed out for yourself, I've already given it to you. I've given you the printed out copy. Please just highlight it, write it down. I told you this is going to be an informal assessment. So again, please take it seriously. Apart from that, I'm just going to upload on your Edmodo very soon as well. But this is what you have to do. You have to create a timeline from the current stance of fiscal policy, business, which is basically what we discussed in the beginning. That is here. So that's 14.5, page 293. Okay, I'm going to be adding all of this in your Edmodo instructions. Write down the recent changes in fiscal policy in the form of a timeline again. So that's basically section 14.5. Then you have to, on a separate page, write down all the details that you find about the 2019-2020 budget, basically all the fiscal stimulus that the government gave to the people. That's also discussed in section 14.5. And lastly, take notes from the document Economic Response to the Coronavirus. I tried to make it as short as possible, but I don't think it was short enough. But regardless, you still have around 25 minutes or 15 minutes to do this. Do this and then go back home and do this as well, please. I'll try and give you some time in class tomorrow. I'm not too sure, but I'm just going to open up the submission box for this up until tomorrow. So up until Friday, 11:59 p.m. So you have today, the whole day today, and then you have the whole day tomorrow to do this. But this is really, really important. These are basically notes that you need for fiscal policy. And currently, during the COVID-19 time, the most important thing you need to know is really just everything, but it's fiscal policy. Because the government has massively implemented a lot of fiscal stimulus to help boost economic growth. And we've studied that fiscal stimulus is only majorly implemented during a recession. So this guaranteed some part of this will be in the HSC.